Today we will explore one of the most fascinating and challenging realities of the Middle Ages, the extreme diet of warriors during entire months of uninterrupted marching across the European continent and beyond. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Imagine a column of men stretching for miles, advancing slowly over dirt roads, carrying on their shoulders the weight of their armor, their weapons, their fears, and their ambitions. The Middle Ages was an era of constant conflicts, of kingdoms fought over inch by inch, of crusades that crossed continents, and of battles that defined the fate of entire nations. Behind the glint of swords and banners fluttering in the wind, however, lay a much less glorious reality, the silent daily battle against hunger, fatigue, and the limits of the human body. For centuries, between roughly the years 500 and 1500 of the Common Era, medieval armies moved across all of Europe and beyond, covering distances that today would seem almost impossible to us without any motorized means of transportation. An army on campaign could march between 20 and 30 kilometers a day under favorable conditions, and this relentless pace demanded an amount of energy that the food of the era could barely supply. What these warriors ate, how they survived, how their bodies endured this extreme effort for weeks and even months on end, that is the story we are going to tell. To understand the diet of the medieval warrior on campaign, one must first comprehend the context in which they lived. Medieval Europe was not the world of abundance that cinema sometimes portrays. It was a continent of great inequality, where agricultural production depended entirely on weather conditions and the manual labor of a peasant majority. Bread was the central food of Western civilization in that period. It was what sustained not only peasants, but also soldiers, merchants, and nobles. And when an army set off on the march, the issue of supply became the greatest logistical challenge of the era. Medieval generals knew very well that a hungry army was a defeated army long before any battle. The Latin expression exercitus sine impedimentis, which means an army without impediments, captured an ideal almost impossible to achieve in practice. In reality, every major military campaign depended on a complex supply system that included supply trains, temporary storehouses, agreements with local communities, and frequently resort to the resources of the territory through which the army passed. Bread, or rather a hardened and completely dry version of it, was the core of the marching soldier's diet. Called biscuit or panis biscoctus in Latin, which literally means bread cooked twice, this food was baked in an oven in 2 stages, precisely to eliminate all moisture and prevent the growth of fungi and bacteria. The result was a compact, extraordinarily hard block that could last for weeks or even months without spoiling. For soldiers, chewing it was an exercise in patience. Many soaked it in water, broth, or alcoholic beverages to soften it enough to eat without risking their teeth. This hardtack biscuit was, most of the time, produced from wheat flour, rye, or a mixture of both, depending on the army's region of origin. Wheat was considered superior and was reserved for those of higher status, while common soldiers often had to settle for rye or oat bread, which was coarser, darker, and bitterer in taste. Nutritionally, these breads were reasonably caloric. A daily ration of about 800 grams to 1 kilogram of biscuit could provide between 2,000 and 2,500 calories. For men marching for hours on end, carrying heavy equipment, this was clearly insufficient. The caloric need of a warrior on campaign was extraordinary. Modern studies estimate that a soldier on an intense march, carrying armor, weapons, and personal belongings, could burn between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day. That is double or triple what a sedentary person consumes today. And since medieval foods were mostly minimally processed and relatively low in fat, meeting this energy demand was a constant and often impossible challenge. The direct consequence was progressive weight loss, a decrease in muscle strength, and the gradual weakening of the body over weeks of campaign. Besides hardtack, the medieval soldier's basic ration included salted or smoked meat, usually pork bacon, dried beef, or salted fish. Salt was the universal preservative of the era, and large quantities of it were used to preserve proteins that would otherwise spoil quickly. Salted fish, especially cod and herring, was particularly valuable both for its durability and its high protein content. On days of religious abstinence, which by the rule of the Catholic Church occurred every Friday, and on other days of the liturgical calendar, meat was forbidden and fish became the only available source of protein. It is important to note that religious regulations were not ignored even on campaign. Medieval armies in Christian Europe submitted to ecclesiastical calendars relatively strictly, which meant that the soldiers' diet was even more restricted at certain times of the year. During Lent, which lasted 40 days before Easter, meat, dairy products and eggs were forbidden, and soldiers had to feed exclusively on fish, legumes and bread. On campaigns that coincided with this period, the nutritional situation became even more critical, testing the physical endurance of everyone involved to the limit. Legumes completed the basic menu of the soldier on campaign. Peas, beans, lentils, and chickpeas were rich in proteins and complex carbohydrates, easy to transport, and relatively simple to prepare. The most common form of consumption was pottage, a thick, generic stew that varied enormously depending on available ingredients. When there were time and resources, it could include chunks of meat, aromatic herbs, and vegetables gathered by the roadside. When there was nothing else, it was simply grains or legumes boiled in salted water. This stew was the heart of collective meals in military camps, and its preparation often fell to the soldiers themselves, who took turns with kitchen duties among themselves. The problem with pottage was that it required time to prepare, time that was not always available. On forced marches or in situations of military urgency, lighting a fire and cooking legumes for hours was simply not feasible. In those circumstances, soldiers had to make do with what they could eat without preparation. Hardened biscuit, some dried meat, perhaps a piece of aged cheese. Cheese, in fact, was another valuable food in campaign rations, as it combined protein and fat in a compact and relatively durable format, capable of enduring the rigors of a prolonged march. The issue of hydration was just as critical as that of food. Water was frequently unfit for direct consumption, contaminated by animal and human waste along marching routes. The medieval solution to this problem was elegantly practical, drinking beer or wine instead of water. It was not a decadent luxury, but a public health necessity, even if medieval people did not understand the mechanisms involved. The fermentation process killed many disease-causing organisms, making beer and wine much safer than water from contaminated rivers and wells. The medieval beer consumed by soldiers was very different from modern beers. Known as weak beer or small beer in English tradition, it had a very low alcohol content, between 1 and 2%, and was consumed in large quantities throughout the day, including during marches. A soldier could drink between 4 and 8 liters of this beer daily, which contributed to his hydration without causing significant drunkenness. Wine, more common in southern European armies, served a similar function and was often mixed with water to be consumed more safely. Both were, therefore, foods in the most functional sense of the word, sources of energy and hydration in equal measure. The transport of liquids was another formidable logistical challenge. The barrels accompanying armies were heavy, bulky, and fragile. On rough terrain, many broke or leaked, compromising supplies. Wine and beer rations were, therefore, frequently irregular. There were days of abundance and days of absolute drought, in which soldiers were forced to drink water from questionable sources and suffered the inevitable consequences to their health and fighting capacity. A fundamental aspect of medieval military logistics was the practice of foraging, the active search for food in the territory through which the army passed. Foraging was at once a necessity and a constant risk. Soldiers assigned to this task branched off from the main column in groups to gather, purchase, or requisition food from local populations. In Allied territory, or under the army's own control, this requisition was formalized, and at least in theory, peasants received some form of compensation. In enemy territory, foraging often turned into plundering, leaving behind a trail of devastation that further weakened the opponent's economic base. Medieval captains understood that uncontrolled foraging was a serious problem. Besides devastating the region and creating animosity with the local population, soldiers who strayed from the column were vulnerable to ambushes. For this reason, many commanders imposed strict rules on who could forage when and under what conditions. However, when central supplies failed, which happened with alarming regularity, these rules tended to be ignored, and chaotic foraging became the norm, with all its unpredictable consequences. The campaigns of the Crusades, which led European armies from the 11th to the 13th century into the Middle East, represent one of the most extreme cases of food challenges in medieval military history. The Crusaders encountered climates radically different from what they knew. The dry summer heat of the Levant was devastating to men accustomed to the damp cold of northern Europe. The food they tried to bring from home deteriorated much faster in these conditions, and locally available foodstuffs were often completely unfamiliar to them. During the First Crusade, which set out in 1096 and reached Jerusalem in 1099, Christian armies faced alternating phases of relative abundance and severe famine. In the regions of Anatolia and Syria, where local supplies were uncertain and Seljuk armies adopted scorched earth tactics, removing or destroying food resources ahead of the invaders, the Crusaders endured periods when hunger was a constant presence in the ranks. Records of the era describe soldiers eating roots, tree bark, and dead animals found along the way. Horses, animals of immense strategic importance, were slaughtered for human consumption in moments of desperation, depriving knights of their primary advantage in combat. The Siege of Antioch in 1097 and 1098 is frequently cited as one of the darkest moments of the Crusader food experience. The city, heavily walled and well supplied, held out for months while the besiegers suffered from growing food scarcity. The Crusader army, rather than destabilizing the enemy through siege, found itself weakened by progressive starvation. It is estimated that a significant fraction of the casualties in that siege were caused not by direct enemy action, but by physical debilitation resulting from prolonged malnutrition, which made bodies more vulnerable to disease and less capable of enduring continuous effort. The creative solution found by many crusaders in unfamiliar territories was adaptation, learning from local populations which plants were edible, how to prepare unfamiliar grains, and how to preserve food in hot climates. This involuntary transfer of culinary and dietary knowledge had significant historical ramifications. Many soldiers returning to Europe brought back with them not only relics and battle experiences, but also new ingredients, culinary techniques, and perspectives on food that contributed to the slow transformation of medieval European cuisine over the following centuries. In Northern Europe, armies fighting endless wars between rival kingdoms faced equally severe dietary challenges. European cold, especially during the winter months, was a formidable enemy. Winter campaigns were rare, precisely because keeping an army fed and warm in that season was exponentially harder than in summer. The freezing of rivers eliminated sources of fresh water, hardened ground made digging for roots and tubers impossible, and the absence of pasture compromised the capacity to transport supplies. The 100 Years' War, which stretched from 1337 to 1453 between the English and the French, is particularly revealing about the food conditions of medieval warriors on prolonged campaigns. English armies operating in French territory relied on a complex supply system by sea and land, with ships bringing provisions from England and storehouses established in controlled fortresses along the Norman coast. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 was fought by an English army that had covered hundreds of kilometers through the interior of France, under conditions of severe scarcity. The soldiers arrived at the battlefield visibly weakened by hunger and bowel diseases that had afflicted the army throughout the march. Yet despite these conditions, the English longbowmen achieved a memorable victory over a French army that significantly outnumbered them. Historians debate to this day to what extent the physical condition of the combatants influenced the outcome of that battle, but the episode clearly illustrates how food and health were military variables just as important as strategy or weaponry. The physical state of an army, shaped directly by what it ate and drank over weeks of marching, could be decisive for the outcome of clashes that settled the future of entire kingdoms. Knights, the military elite of the Middle Ages, had a relationship with campaign food that differed from that of common soldiers, though not as different as their social status might suggest. In theory, a knight possessed more resources, and his retinue included squires and servants responsible for preparing his meals. In practice, during long, intense marches, the food hierarchy tended to flatten out. Everyone ate whatever was available, and frequently what was available was very little, regardless of the titles a man carried. A knight's gear on the march weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms in armor alone, not counting weapons and personal belongings. Riding with that weight for hours on end demanded a considerable energy output, and knights needed substantial nourishment to maintain not only their own combat capability, but also that of their horses. An active warhorse could consume between 10 and 15 kilograms of hay or pasture per day, in addition to abundant water. Securing food for the animals was often as challenging as securing food for the men, and a knight without a horse was, in military terms, a drastically diminished warrior. In summer, foraging was made easier by the availability of wild berries, edible herbs, and fresh pasture for the animals. The productive terrain of temperate Europe offered natural food resources that a trained army knew how to exploit. Wild berries, crab apples, edible mushrooms, roots, and tubers, all of these supplemented basic rations and provided nutrients that dry, salted foods could not offer. Soldiers with campaign experience developed considerable practical botanical knowledge, identifying edible plants along marching routes with an efficiency that would draw attention today. Vitamins, a concept that did not exist in medieval language or knowledge, were nonetheless vital to the survival of soldiers. Vitamin C deficiency, which causes scurvy, was a recurring problem on long campaigns, where the consumption of fresh fruit and vegetables was halted for weeks or months. The condition progressed insidiously, starting with growing fatigue and irritability, advancing to severe muscle weakness, and progressively compromising the body's ability to function under stressful conditions. Medieval physicians recognized the syndrome clinically, but without understanding its nutritional cause, attempted to treat it with herbs and concoctions that sometimes helped, when by accident they contained vitamin C, and sometimes had no visible effect. Equally critical was the issue of salt as an electrolyte. Salt was not merely a condiment, it was an essential nutrient for muscle and nerve function, and its absence in a body sweating profusely over hours of marching had severe consequences. Muscle cramps, mental confusion, and physical collapse were documented consequences of prolonged salt dehydration. The strategic value of salt for medieval armies was such that its distribution was strictly controlled and recorded in military treatises and administrative records of the best documented campaigns. The medieval Muslim world, with its armies that frequently confronted the Crusaders and fought their own wars of expansion and territorial consolidation, had a nutritional approach different from the European one, influenced by a distinct agricultural and culinary tradition. Islamic armies of the era, particularly those from the time of Saladin in the late 12th century, were often praised by contemporaries for their superior logistical discipline. The Ayyubid supply system was more centralized and efficient than most European systems of the time, which was reflected in the better physical condition of soldiers at many points during military clashes. Medieval Islamic cuisine already incorporated ingredients such as rice, various spices, sugar, dried fruits, and a variety of legumes that enriched soldiers' diets far beyond what the typical European menu allowed. Dates, in particular, were an extraordinarily energy-efficient food, rich in sugars, minerals, and fiber, portable and long-lasting, and were consumed in large quantities by armies operating in the arid regions of the Middle East. Dates appear repeatedly in medieval Arab chronicles, described as an essential provision for long crossings through the desert and inhospitable terrain. In Central Asia, the Mongol warriors who built the largest land empire in history, between the 13th and 14th centuries, developed a campaign food system that was admired and feared in equal measure. The Mongols were masters of extreme mobility. Their cavalry armies could cover distances that no contemporary European army could match, and this speed depended on a food strategy radically different from that practiced in the West. Instead of carrying vast quantities of supplies in slow baggage trains, Mongol warriors relied fundamentally on their mounts and the territory through which they passed, transforming logistics into a high-level art of improvisation. The horse was not merely transport for the Mongols. It was also an emergency source of food. Horse meat was regularly consumed, and animal fat was used both in cooking and to protect the skin against the extreme cold of the steppes. Fermented mare's milk, called kumisi, was the staple drink of Mongol warriors, mildly alcoholic, rich in proteins and nutrients, and relatively easy to carry in leather waterskins. A Mongol division on campaign could subsist for weeks almost exclusively on what their horses and the territory provided, giving them unprecedented logistical flexibility in the military history of the era. Supply management was, therefore, an art and a science that the best medieval commanders took extremely seriously. Edward IV of England, who led military campaigns in Scotland and Wales in the late 13th century, was recognized by his contemporaries as a master of military logistics. His campaigns were preceded by months of meticulous preparations that included purchasing and storing massive quantities of grain, legumes, salted meat and wine, alongside the careful organization of supply routes, to ensure a continuous flow of provisions for his troops throughout the entire campaign. The role of salt in the medieval military economy deserves special attention. Salt was simultaneously a food ingredient, an essential preservative, and a commodity of strategic value equivalent to gold in certain regions. Salt trade routes crisscrossed medieval Europe, and control over salt sources was a primary element of political and economic power. For an army on campaign, the loss of salt supply could be as devastating as losing weapons or horses, for without it, preserving the meats and fish that formed the protein foundation of the soldier's diet was impossible. Conditions in medieval military camps further exacerbated nutritional problems. The proximity of thousands of men, horses, and other animals in relatively confined spaces created conditions ripe for the spread of disease. Contamination of water and food was frequent, and gastrointestinal illnesses could devastate an army at a speed no enemy cavalry could match. In many medieval campaigns, casualties caused by diseases associated with poor hygiene and compromised food far outnumbered those inflicted directly in battle. The dining experience varied according to hierarchical position within the army, but this variation had unavoidable practical limits. The king or great lord leading the campaign certainly ate better than the anonymous infantry soldier. He had access to fresher meat, better quality wine, and spices and seasonings that made meals more palatable, but even the wealthiest could not entirely escape the vicissitudes of campaign supplies. When the supply train was intercepted, or when the surrounding territory had been exhausted by foraging, scarcity leveled everyone to some extent. There are fascinating records of feasts and banquets that medieval commanders held for their men, in moments of victory or strategic pause in the campaign. After capturing a well-supplied city or fortress, the victorious army gained temporary access to food reserves that radically transformed the soldier's diet. In those moments, wines stored in cellars were distributed, barn animals were slaughtered for the collective meal, and camp cooking approached, for a few hours or days, something far more substantial. These episodes of abundance were not only nutritionally important, but also psychologically essential for maintaining troop morale after long periods of deprivation. The contrast between these moments of plenty and long periods of scarcity created a highly irregular eating pattern that soldiers' bodies had to absorb over months of campaign. Human metabolic adaptability, to function reasonably well during significant calorie restriction and to make the most of periods of abundance, was a survival trait that likely distinguished those who completed a campaign from those who succumbed along the way. These were the men history would call warriors, not merely the bravest, but often simply the most resilient. Returning home when it occurred entailed a reverse dietary readaptation. Soldiers who had subsisted for months on minimal rations and low-quality food frequently experienced discomfort upon returning to the more varied diet of peacetime. Their bodies, adapted to scarcity, reacted unpredictably to sudden abundance. This phenomenon was empirically observed by medieval physicians without the vocabulary or theoretical framework to describe it accurately, an insight that modern medicine would confirm centuries later. Medieval wars left deep marks not only on the politics and geography of Europe, but also on the bodies and personal stories of the countless combatants who fought them. For every knight glorified in the chronicles of the era, there were hundreds of anonymous soldiers who endured the same conditions of food deprivation, the same relentless physical wear, the same routine of endless marching days fueled by hard biscuits, water of questionable quality, and the hope that the next supply would arrive in time. It was these anonymous men who together drove armies forward and defined the fates of nations. Understanding the diet of these warriors is understanding an essential dimension of the human experience in times of conflict, a dimension that grand historical narratives tend to overlook in favor of heroic deeds and strategic maneuvers. The most fundamental battle any medieval army fought was not against the enemy on the open field, but against their own physical and logistical limitations that defined the boundaries of everything that could be accomplished. It was a battle that brought no glory nor was recorded in chronicles, yet determined day after day who would arrive on the battlefield in fit condition to fight. Looking at this history is also an invitation to recognize how much food, this daily act we so often take for granted, has been, throughout human history, a variable of power, resilience, and survival. Medieval warriors were not superhumans immune to hunger. They were human beings who learned, out of relentless necessity, to wring the most out of minimal resources, to keep the body going when everything indicated it should stop, and to take one more step when an empty stomach and exhausted feet pleaded for a halt. History teaches us that empires are not built solely with steel and ambition. They are also built with hard bread, hastily cooked legumes, and the stubborn persistence of the human body to keep moving forward even when all conditions conspired for it to stop. This is the silent legacy of medieval warriors, not merely the territory they conquered or the kingdoms they shaped, but the revelation of how far human beings can go when driven by duty, faith, or the simple and powerful need to survive. If this journey into the past sparked in you the same curiosity that fuels every documentary we produce here, that feeling that behind every major historical event there are entire lives waiting to be discovered, then the next step is simple. Subscribe to this channel and become part of this ongoing investigation. Every video is an invitation to go beyond what textbooks tell us, to explore the most human layers of history. Leave a comment telling us what caught your attention most in this story. We want to know whether it was the resilience of the Crusaders, the logistical brilliance of the Mongols, or the invisible behind-the-scenes of battles that changed the world. Like this video if it added something to your day, and share it with someone who, like you, believes that understanding how the world came to be is the best way to understand who we are today.